Undercover CEO sees customer throw food at a black waitress. His unexpected action leaves everyone. What if you were publicly humiliated by a customer, and the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company watched, deciding to step in? What would you do next? The Southern Table was more than just a restaurant in downtown Atlanta. It was a heartbeat. Nestled between glass skyscrapers and historic brick buildings, its warm lights and savory aromas drew a steady crowd of locals, tourists, and corporate types. The walls, adorned with black and white photos of Atlanta's past, told stories of resilience, but for Jasmine Williams, the real stories unfolded every day on the restaurant floor. At 24, Jasmine was a force of nature. Her smile could disarm even the grumpiest customer, and her quick wit turned strangers into regulars. She'd been waitressing at the Southern Table since she was 19, her nimble hands balancing trays of fried chicken and collard greens while her mind raced toward a bigger dream, a career in marketing. She'd taken night classes at a local community college, piecing together credits when she could afford them, but the grind of double shifts left little room for anything else. Her apartment, a cramped one-bedroom shared with her younger sister, was a constant reminder of the bills piling up and the dreams deferred. Jasmine's life wasn't easy, but she carried herself with a quiet strength. Her dark skin, coiled hair, and warm brown eyes made her a target for some customers' prejudice. Comments about her attitude, assumptions about her intelligence, or outright slurs disguised as jokes. She'd learned to let the words roll off her, but each one left a mark. Her manager, Greg, wasn't much better. A middle-aged man with a permanent scowl, he favored the other waitresses, mostly white, mostly younger, and dismissed Jasmine's hustle as just doing her job. Promotions, raises, those went to others, despite Jasmine's flawless record and knack for turning tense situations into moments of connection. Still, Jasmine loved the Southern Table. It was her community, her stage. She knew the regulars' orders by heart: Miss Clara's sweet tea with extra lemon, Mr. Thompson's ribs with no sauce, and she poured herself into every shift. But the weight of it all, the microaggressions, the exhaustion, the dream that felt just out of reach, was starting to wear her down. Richard Davis was a storm cloud in a tailored suit. A 62-year-old real estate investor, he strode into the Southern Table every few weeks like he owned the place. His silver hair and polished loafers screamed wealth, but his demeanor screamed entitlement. He'd bark orders, complain about the smallest details, and leave tips that barely covered a coffee. To Richard, the wait staff were invisible, except when he wanted to make them feel small. And Jasmine? She was his favorite target. "Girl, you call this service?" he'd sneer, his voice loud enough to turn heads. Or, "I bet you don't even know what's in this dish." Jasmine would smile, nod, and keep moving, her pride a shield against his venom. She'd overheard him once muttering to a friend about people like her not belonging in places like this. She didn't flinch, but the words burned. On this particular Tuesday, the lunch rush was in full swing. The air smelled of cornbread and smoked brisket, and the dining room buzzed with chatter. Jasmine weaved through tables, her tray loaded with plates, her mind on autopilot. Richard sat at his usual spot by the window, already tapping his fork impatiently. He demanded a specific table, a specific wine, a 2018 Pinot Noir, chilled to exactly 55 degrees, and a plate of shrimp and grits, done right this time. Jasmine delivered it all with her usual grace, but she braced herself. Richard always found something to complain about. Across the room, at a small corner table, sat Evan Carter. To the untrained eye, he was just another customer, mid-40s, unassuming in a navy blazer and jeans, nursing a glass of iced tea while scrolling through his phone. But Evan was no ordinary diner. As the CEO of the Carter Group, a tech conglomerate worth millions, he was a man of influence, wealth, and curiosity. For weeks, he'd been visiting the Southern Table incognito, blending into the crowd to study the restaurant's pulse. His latest project was a philanthropy initiative aimed at uplifting working-class communities, and he wanted to understand the lives of people like the waitstaff, people who kept places like this alive. Evan had noticed Jasmine from his first visit. Her energy was magnetic, her professionalism unshakable. He'd watched her diffuse a drunk customer's rant with a single quip, charm an elderly couple into leaving a 50% tip, and handle a spilled drink without missing a beat. But he'd also seen the way some customers treated her, the sideways glances, the condescending tones. He'd overheard Greg dismiss her request for a shift change with a curt, "You're lucky to have this job." Evan's notebook, tucked in his pocket, was filled with observations about Jasmine's resilience, but also about the quiet injustices she faced. Today, as he sipped his tea, Evan's eyes kept drifting to Jasmine. He wasn't just impressed by her work ethic, he was moved by her humanity. She didn't just serve food, she built moments. And yet, he could see the strain behind her smile, the way her shoulders tensed when certain customers spoke to her. He wondered how much longer she could keep it up. The lunch rush hit its peak, and the restaurant was a symphony of clinking glasses and hurried footsteps. Jasmine delivered Richard's shrimp and grits, setting the plate down with a practiced smile. "Here you go, sir. Anything else I can get for you?" Richard barely looked at her. He poked at the grits with his fork, his face twisting. "This is cold," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the din. "You call this food? You people can't even get a simple dish right." Jasmine's smile didn't falter. "I'm so sorry, sir. I can have the kitchen remake it." "No," Richard snapped, shoving the plate forward. "You've already ruined my meal." "Typical." His voice grew louder, drawing eyes from nearby tables. Then, in a flash of anger, he grabbed the plate and flung it across the table. Grits and shrimp splattered across Jasmine's uniform, the plate crashing to the floor with a deafening crack. The restaurant went silent. Every eye was on Jasmine, standing there with sauce dripping down her apron, her face a mask of composure. She didn't cry, didn't yell. She reached for a napkin, wiping her hands slowly, deliberately. Inside, her heart pounded, her throat tight with humiliation. She'd dealt with rude customers before, but this was different. This was public, raw, meant to degrade her. Richard leaned back, smirking. "Maybe next time you'll do your job right," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Jasmine's hands trembled as she picked up the broken pieces of the plate. She could feel the weight of every stare, the pity, the judgment. But she wouldn't break. Not here, not now. She'd worked too hard, endured too much, to let this man take her dignity. Evan had seen enough. His jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold, his fingers tightening around his glass. He'd spent weeks observing, staying quiet, but this was a line crossed. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked toward Richard's table with a calm that belied the fire in his chest. "Excuse me," Evan said, tapping Richard on the shoulder. His voice was steady, but there was steel in it. "You'll be leaving now. Your behavior is unacceptable in any setting, let alone here." Richard turned, his face a mix of surprise and indignation. "Who do you think you are?" he sputtered, his eyes narrowing. "You don't tell me what to do." Evan's expression didn't waver. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear. "I'm Evan Carter. And I own this restaurant, among many other things. Not only will you never be served here again, but I will make sure you never step foot in any of my establishments again." The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, his face reddening. The other customers stared, some whispering, others frozen. Jasmine, still holding the broken plate, looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Greg, who'd been watching from the bar, went pale. Richard grabbed his coat, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed out, leaving a trail of stunned silence. Evan turned to Jasmine, his expression softening. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," he said quietly. "It's not your fault." Jasmine took the handkerchief, her hands still shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know who Evan was, not really, but in that moment, his words felt like a lifeline. The next day, Jasmine arrived at the southern table for her shift, her uniform clean but her mind still reeling. The incident with Richard had spread like wildfire among the staff, and whispers followed her as she tied her apron. Greg avoided her eyes. busying himself with paperwork. The other waitresses offered sympathetic smiles, but Jasmine felt exposed, like the stain on her uniform had marked her permanently. At noon, Evan walked in. This time, he wasn't incognito. He wore a tailored suit, his presence commanding but not intimidating. He asked for Jasmine by name, and when she approached, he smiled. "Can you take a break? I'd like to talk over lunch." Jasmine hesitated. She wasn't used to customers, let alone someone like Evan, wanting to talk to her outside of taking orders. But something in his eyes, a quiet sincerity, made her nod. They sat at a corner table, and over plates of cornbread and iced tea, Evan revealed his identity fully. He told her about the Carter Group, his philanthropy project, and how he'd been watching her for weeks, not just as a waitress, but as someone with potential. "I'm launching a new initiative," he said, leaning forward. "It's about corporate responsibility, fighting social inequality. I need a marketing lead, someone who understands people, who can tell stories that matter." "Jasmine, I think that's you." Jasmine blinked, her fork frozen midway to her mouth. "Me? I'm just a waitress. I don't have a degree, or—" "You have more than a degree," Evan interrupted. "You have grit, heart, and a way of connecting with people I've rarely seen. I watched you handle that situation yesterday with more grace than most CEOs could muster. This isn't charity, it's an opportunity. You're the right person for this." The offer was dizzying. A six-figure salary, a chance to escape the grind, a platform to use her voice. But as Evan spoke, Jasmine's mind raced. She thought of her sister, who relied on her income. Her co-workers, who'd become like family. The Southern table, for all its flaws, was her home. Could she leave it behind? And could she trust Evan, a man whose world was so different from hers, to truly understand the inequalities she'd faced her whole life? That night, Jasmine sat on her couch, her sister asleep in the next room. She stared at the acceptance letter Evan had emailed her, the words blurring on her phone screen. It was everything she'd dreamed of, a way out, a way up. But it came with a cost. The corporate world was a different beast, one where she'd seen black women like her tokenized, sidelined, or forced to assimilate. Evan seemed genuine, but what if his good intentions weren't enough? What if she lost herself in the process? She thought of her mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to raise her and her sister, always telling her, "Your voice is your power, Jasmine. Don't let anyone take it." Accepting Evan's offer meant amplifying that voice, but it also meant stepping into a world that might try to silence it in new ways. The next morning, Jasmine returned to the Southern table, her decision still unmade. The restaurant was quieter than usual, the air heavy with the aftermath of Richard's outburst. As she refilled coffee for a regular, she overheard Greg talking to another waitress about cutting her shifts. "She's getting too much attention," he said, his voice low. "We don't need the drama." Something snapped in Jasmine. She'd spent years swallowing her anger, proving her worth, taking the high road. But no more. She marched to Greg's office, her heart pounding. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Greg looked up, startled. "Jasmine, I'm busy." "No," she said, cutting him off. "You're going to listen. I've given everything to this place. I've dealt with customers like Richard, with your favoritism, with being overlooked for years. And I'm done. You're going to start treating me, and everyone else here, with respect, or I'm gone. And I'm taking my regulars with me." Greg's mouth fell open, but before he could respond, Evan appeared in the doorway. He'd come to check on Jasmine, but now he stood silently, watching her take control. When she finished, he stepped forward. "She's right," he said to Greg. "And as the owner, I'm making it clear, things are going to change here. Starting with you." Jasmine accepted Evan's offer, but on her terms. She negotiated a role that allowed her to work remotely part-time, staying connected to her community. She also insisted on a mentorship program for the restaurant staff, giving others like her a shot at something bigger. Evan, inspired by her vision, agreed, and together they began reshaping the Southern table into a place where everyone, regardless of race or background, could thrive. In her new role at the Carter Group, Jasmine found her voice. She led campaigns that highlighted stories of resilience, like her own, and pushed for policies that addressed systemic inequality. She wasn't just a marketer, she was a changemaker. Evan became more than a boss. He became an ally, learning from Jasmine's perspective and using his privilege to amplify her work. One day, months later, Jasmine returned to the southern table as a customer. The staff greeted her like family, and Greg, now humbled, nodded respectfully. As she sat at her old favorite table, she looked around at the familiar faces, some new, some old, and felt a quiet pride. She'd taken a leap, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been underestimated. Across the room, Evan watched her, his notebook now filled with ideas for his next project, a foundation in Jasmine's name, dedicated to empowering young women of color. He raised his glass to her, a silent toast to the woman who'd changed his perspective, and his world.